Hello students. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the meaning and importance of the level of analysis. Contributions of prominent international relations scholars like Kenneth Walters, David Singer, Merton Kaplan, Barry Wujan and William Weber were discussed. In today's lecture, we will cover four levels of analysis: the individual level of analysis, domestic level of analysis, the regional level of analysis and the systemic level of analysis. We will end our discussion with some important concluding remarks analysis. So now let me focus on the four level of analysis. So we have discussed the ideas of different scholars of international politics, starting with Kenneth Walters. So now let me focus on the basis of those discussion. We can study at least four main levels of analysis. The first starting with the individual level of analysis, then the domestic or the state level analysis, regional analysis and the systemic level of analysis. Although the level of analysis is not always fixed. So we can identify only the four, but that does not mean the level of analysis is only restricted to four. So different scholars have used different levels of analysis, but we will basically focus on the four level of analysis. Let me first focus on the first level of analysis, that is the individual level of analysis. This level of analysis contains that human nature is the driving force of international politics. So according to the scholars who particularly focus on the individual level of analysis, they consider that you can to some extent understand the working of international politics by focusing on the individual level or the individual leaders. So they locate the cause of events in individual leaders or the immediate circle of decision makers within a particular country. So it is not that the only prime minister or president they are responsible, rather those who are functioning within the circle of decision making, maybe their foreign minister, maybe their diplomats. So they all are important in their individual capacity as well as the official capacity in thinking about the country's foreign policy or influencing the working of its foreign policy. The individual level of analysis greatly depends on the leadership style, belief, goals and the value system. So these are basic parameters, these are the basic ingredients on the basis of which you can understand the individual level of analysis. What is the leadership style of a particular leader? How he is influenced by his belief system. What are his individual leadership goals? What is the value system in which he is operating? So these are all important factors that help us to understand the role of individual in undertaking a particular kind of foreign policy. In this view, the very personalities of leaders shape foreign policy goals. So basically, if you want to understand the foreign policy of a particular country, so you have to focus on the individual leaders, how they operate, what they think, what is his or her value system. So these are all important factors that help us to understand the country's foreign policy or the foreign policy of any country. So in case you want to understand India's foreign policy since 2014, particularly after the coming of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister, you can't understand India's foreign policy without focusing on the role of Narendra Modi. And if you want to study the foreign policy of India since 2019, you can't study it without focusing on the role of the Prime Minister and the role of the Foreign Minister, that is Dr. Jaishankar. So these individuals are playing an important role in the transformation of India's foreign policy, in the making of India's foreign policy, in the implementation of India's foreign policy. Some historical examples include the role of Adolf Hitler for the beginning of the Second World War, the role of American President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev for the end of the Cold War, and also you can include the example of P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh in India's economic reform. So you can't understand these events without focusing on the role of the political leaders, the role of those presidents and prime ministers who occupied the office during that period. However, this level of analysis only allows for a narrow understanding of global politics and the forces at play. So if you just focus on the individual analysis, it may explain something, but you may not understand a particular issue in its totality or in a very comprehensive way. So, that is the problem with this level of analysis. In recent years, it is overtaken by the decision making approach, which focuses more on the general factors than the particularities of the individuals. So, definitely you can get some idea by focusing on the role of individuals, but it is not in this interdependent world, in this globalized world, in this interconnected world, you can't understand the making of any country's foreign policy just by looking only one factor. So, that is the problem with this level of analysis. Let me now talk about the domestic level of analysis, or the what we call the state level of analysis. Now, those who use domestic or state level of analysis view that the state is the black boxes of the international system. As you might have seen, when there is an air crash, the first effort is to trace out or to get the black boxes of the aircraft, because that contains a lot of vital information before the crash. Similarly, if you want to understand the working of international politics, you have to focus on the working of the states who are autonomous and they are acting in an independent way. Internal character of those states matters most in determining the overall patterns of their behavior. So, if you want to understand the state's role in international politics, you have to focus on their internal characteristics, how they are ordered politically, whether they are democratic countries, they are authoritarian countries, they are totalitarian countries. These kind of things matter a lot in understanding the particular country's role in foreign policy. Similarly, their geographical position, whether they are landlocked, they are located in the sea or island nations like United Kingdom, their historical ties, like you can't understand India's present policy towards Russia without going to historical close relationship India had with the former Soviet Union. So, these historical ties are also important, and then their economic standing, whether you are a global economic superpower, whether you are a rising economic power, whether you are a economically dependent power like Pakistan or North Korea, or you are facing economic crisis like Maldives or Sri Lanka. So, your economic standing in international politics, your domestic standing in economic power, so they are all important factors to understand the domestic level of analysis. Key indicators include the policies proposed and decided by the governments, statements of top level politicians, and also the role of diplomats. So, when you focus on the domestic level of analysis, you have to understand the role played by the government, the statement of top leader politicians like the foreign minister, and the role and behavior of other diplomats like the foreign secretary, the joint secretary, the additional secretary. They are all playing an important role in the making of the country's foreign policy, in the implementation of the country's foreign policy, in diplomacy, in all sort of negotiation of a particular country with other countries. Sometimes you can understand the working of domestic level of analysis by focusing on the Cold War. So, you cannot understand the working of the Cold War or the period of Cold War in international politics just by focusing on the military race or the rivalry between the United States and the USSR. You have to understand it as an ideological rivalry between the United States, which was a democratic country, and the USSR, which was a totalitarian or communist country. So, this kind of political order help you to understand what kind of foreign policy they are making. Similarly, Quad is not just a grouping, it is a grouping of democratic countries against a totalitarian country like China, and that is a major criticism of China against the Quad. So, these examples prove that domestic level of analysis is an important factor for understanding international politics. Now, let me focus on the regional factor. Regional level of analysis refers to events and trends that have implications limited to a particular geographical region. The world politics is studied through what is called area studies. The world is divided into many areas like South Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, Middle East, Latin America, Europe, and so many other regions. So, those who want to study international politics or the working of international politics, they can better use the regional framework of analysis or regional level of analysis. The European Union, the operation of NATO, ASEAN, SAARC, they are all examples how they are playing an important role in their respective geographical region. The irrelevance of SAARC can be better understood by the constant rivalry between India and Pakistan. So, you can't understand the working of SAARC as a regional organization without focusing on the ideological rivalry, without focusing on the political rivalry of India and Pakistan, because that helps us to explain why the SAARC is not functioning the way it was functioning or the way it was established. That helps us to understand this aspect. India's closeness towards BIMSTEC, Indian Ocean Rim Association, and focus on sub-regional cooperation was also due to the SAARC factor. So, if the SAARC is not functioning well, so that explains that why India is now shifting towards the other regional organizations such as the BIMSTEC or the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and it is also thinking of sub-regional cooperation by including some countries like Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, like Bhutan or Nepal, those who share some concern or those who concern similar concern with India. So, that can also be understood through the regional level of analysis. China's deeper than the ocean and the taller than the Himalayas friendship with Pakistan can also be explained in terms of the India-China rivalry in the region. So, if the Chinese claim or the Pakistanis claim that their friendship is taller than the Himalayas or deeper than the Indian Ocean or any other ocean for that matter, that to some extent also explains how the India-China relationship actually operates, how China wants to balance Indian power, how China wants to counter Indian power, and for that it is using Pakistan as a proxy to engage India. So, regional level of analysis helps you to understand how international politics operate at a regional level. Now, let us discuss the systemic level of analysis. The system level analysis examines state behavior by looking at the international system of which they are the parts. So, international system consists of the states and non-state actors, we have already discussed it, and those who are talking of the systemic level of analysis are using systemic level of analysis, they are particularly looking at the international system and the states, those who constitute an important part of the international system. The idea is that the system exerts a kind of force on the states that compels them to behave and react in a certain predictable ways. So, the states are operating in the international system, and if there is some pressure in the international system, there is some major events, as I said, in the international system, that to some extent explains how a particular state responds to the international system. I can give you the example of India's non-alignment. If there was no Cold War, India would have not followed the policy of non-alignment. So, the international pressure at that time encouraged India to follow the policy of non-alignment. It also implies that the change in the international system will cause a change in the state behavior. So, if there is a sudden change in the international system, like the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, so that also influences a country's foreign policy. You can understand that in a very good way if you focus on India's closeness towards the United States after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So, had Soviet Union not disintegrated, India would not have been very close to the United States. So, if there is a sudden change in the international system that forces the countries to follow and choose foreign policy choices which they never have thought about. So, that is the importance of the systemic level of analysis. A systemic level of the study looks at issues like distribution of political power at the global level, globalization, global governance such as international organizations, laws and norms, and diffusion of technology. So, those particularly who focus on the systemic level of analysis, they will focus on the balance of power, the kind of polarity the international system is undergoing, or the kind of globalization that has interconnected the world economically, politically, in every way. They will also consider factors like global governance, what is the role of United Nations, what is the role of WTO, what is the role of IMF and World Bank So these factors are also important, and also about the importance of laws and norms and the diffusion of technology. So these are all important to understand the systemic level of analysis. It also considers how these factors create conditions that impose themselves structurally on the other levels. So if you want to understand the formulation of a country's foreign policy, you have to understand the importance of all these factors that explain how the structural pressures or structural changes forces the countries to choose a kind of foreign policy. However, it is impossible to explain or predict systemic change on the basis of a system level variable alone. For example, the Soviet Union collapsed in the year 1991, and the long ideological rivalry with the United States is cited as one of the reasons, and that may be a systemic reason. But this is not the only reason for which it disintegrated. There are internal economic reasons. Soviet Union was basically focusing on military power, it was not focusing on its economic power. So that was the major reason why it collapsed. So when you talk about the systemic factor, so that gives some insight on some issues, but it does not give insight on every issue. That is the problem with the systemic level of analysis. Now on the basis of the level of analysis, we have discussed at the individual level, at the state level, at the regional level, and at the global level. We can better understand that in this chart. Now let me explain the level of analysis through this chart. The first is the individual level of analysis that takes into account the personality factor, the leadership style, the individual leaders' goals and the value system. So this level of analysis helps us to some extent to understand the foreign policy of a particular country. Then we talk of the domestic or the state level analysis, where the geographical location, the type of government, the economy, whether you are having a demand economy, you are having a command economy, you are having a mixed economy, or the parties and interest groups, whether you have a BJP government, you have a Congress government. So these are all domestic factors that help us to understand the state level analysis in international relations. Then we have this regional level of analysis that gives importance to these factors, like the regional dispute, the Kashmir issue between India and Pakistan better explains, as I said, the dysfunctioning of SAARC, the political compulsions, like if you look at the democratic elections in any of the Indian neighboring countries, you will find India always becomes an important factor, an important question for the ruling parties and the opposition parties. That explain how you can understand the role of political compulsions. That is the case with Maldives, that is the case with Sri Lanka, that is the case with Nepal, that is also the case with Pakistan. So their political compulsions or the political compulsion of different political parties that help us to explain the regional level of analysis. Then there are security reasons, there are terrorist issue, there are drug trafficking issue, there are small weapons proliferation issue, there are migration issue, there are refugee issues. So they also help us to understand how the regional dynamics operate in a particular region, and how that helps us to analyze the operation of international politics at the regional level. Then let us talk about the systemic level. It refers to the power distribution, whether it is a unipolar world, it is a bipolar world, it is a multipolar world. Then globalization, that explains how the countries are economically integrated, how they are interconnected. Then the international norms and rules, like the human rights issue, the environmental issue, and so many other issues like international law, the working of the multinational companies, the intergovernmental organizations, the military alliances like the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. They all help us to understand how the international politics can be understood through the systemic level. So basically these are the four levels of analysis that to some extent help us to understand the working of international politics at the individual, state level, regional and systemic level. Now let me explain how this four level of analysis can be better understood by giving the example of India's non-alignment policy. At the individual level, you cannot understand India's non-alignment policy without focusing on the role of Nehru in the conceptualization of the term non-alignment, use it as a foreign policy tool and contribution to NAM, especially resisting the idea of NAM becoming a third bloc. When there was the first bloc led by the United States, the second bloc led by the USSR. So, there was a lot of demand that the non-alignment movement that was uniting the small and recently independent countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America to become a third bloc, but it was Nehru who strongly resisted this idea. So, you cannot understand India's non-alignment policy without going to the personality factor of Nehru, his political beliefs, his idea about the world, his idea how international politics operated. So, these are all individual level of analysis through which you can understand India's policy of non-alignment. Then there is a domestic or state level analysis. If India has followed the policy of non-alignment, it is because of its long colonial experience, it is because of its economic compulsion that if India joins one particular bloc, then that will constrain its economic freedom, it will not get economic help or assistance from the other bloc. So, economic reasons and your colonial experience manifested in the Indian freedom struggle, that were the major reasons why India decided to follow the policy of non-alignment. Then you have a regional factor. Had India joined the American bloc or the Soviet bloc at the beginning or during the Cold War, it would have encouraged China to join another bloc, and that would have created a lot of problem for Indian security. So, not allowing China to join a particular bloc was one of the reasons why India decided to follow the policy of non-alignment. And the last was the systemic factor. The beginning of the Cold War, the ideological rivalry between the USA and USSR and the military alliances like the NATO and the Warsaw Pact, they were important reasons why India decided to follow the policy of non-alignment. So, individual level of analysis is important, the domestic factors are also important, the regional level of analysis is also important, and the systemic factors. So, by combining these four level of analysis, you can better understand the Indian policy of non-alignment. Now, let me finish our discussion with some concluding points. The German theoretical physicist Werner K. Heisenberg in the year 1962 said that we have to remember that what we observe is not the nature in itself, but the nature exposed to our method of questioning. That means nature is same, but how you observe that varies from person to person, from methodology to methodology. Thus, being aware and acknowledging the potential gaps in our observation is important. Applying the rigor in our analysis is also important. So, how we observe our phenomena, how we understand the phenomena, how we divide the phenomena, these are all important issues we have to think before selecting any method of analysis. Scholars acknowledge the utility of paying attention to the level of analysis, but they differ on how many levels are actually useful in explaining a particular event. That shows that we have just discussed the 4 level of analysis, but there are scholars who think that we can think of 3 levels, we can think of 6 levels, it depends on the scholar to scholar. Although adding more layers may provide more descriptive context, it makes our explanation and prediction more difficult. So, if you add more level of analysis, that may help you to understand a dynamics which you have not covered through the 4 level of analysis, but the problem is that will make it more difficult to predict something. Similarly, the rise in the number and density of transnational actors has transformed the international system, making this framework little difficult. So, we have discussed it was not the states alone that we can understand, or if you just focus on interstate relations, we can understand the working of international politics. We have to understand also that how the states are playing an important role in international politics, what is the role of non-state actors, what is the role of transnational companies, what is the role of supranational actors. So, since there are more actors than the traditional state centric model, so it is very difficult to understand the working of international politics by just focusing on these 3 or 4 level of analysis. Each of these levels of analysis can be useful in understanding different aspects of international relations and foreign policy. Individual level of analysis, for instance, is useful in understanding the motivations behind a particular leader's foreign policy decisions. Similarly, the state level analysis is useful in understanding the broader factors that influence a state's foreign policy. So, although there are 4 levels of analysis, each individual level of analysis or state level of analysis, they have their own merits, they have their own demerits. So, each one of them definitely helps us to understand some aspects of international politics, but that does not mean that different perspectives could not be used in conjunction with each other. Many of today's political challenges are, on the contrary, so complex that they require our analysis to span across various levels in order to be able to answer our questions and draw meaningful conclusion. So, each of the level of analysis is important, and if you combine those levels of analysis in conjunction with each other, that will help us to understand the way international politics functions. The question of which level of analysis should be used has led to the agent structure debate in the foreign policy analysis. The structure refers to the way international politics operates in the world level, and the agent refers to the role of the states and individuals and their impact on the international system. So, this is a kind of debate that is going on currently in international politics, and but one thing is sure that if the level of analysis is there in international politics, it has substantial influence the way the decision making theory is there in international politics, and the agent structure debate is going on international politics. So, as a scholar, as a student of international politics, we have to understand these 4 levels of analysis, their limitations, their strength, and how we can do great research in international relations by identifying which level of analysis would actually be helpful in our understanding. So, this is an important topic that is of real interest to the students and scholars of international politics, because it helps us the way you have to conduct research, the way you have to analyze international politics. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. At the individual level, we discussed the role of leadership style, beliefs, goals, and the value system. You can easily understand terrorism and Pakistan on the basis of India's leadership. At the domestic level, we focused on the internal character of the state, especially the nature of the political system, their geographical position, historical ties, and economic standing. At the regional level, we discussed the role of geographical contiguity, events, and the trends that have implications for a particular geographical region, may that be South Asia or Indo-Pacific region. The regional level of analysis also emphasizes how regional organizations such as SAARC, conflicts and cooperation impact global politics and governance. At the systemic level, we considered the role of global distribution of power, globalization, global governance, and the diffusion of technology such as the information technology revolution. By using these 4 levels of analysis, we also discussed India's non-alignment policy in the Cold War period. We concluded that since each level of analysis can be useful in understanding different aspects of international relations and foreign policy, so they should be used in conjunction with each other rather than separately. In the next lecture, we will discuss about another interesting topic, that is how to make international relations a truly global discipline. Thank you for your attention. We will meet in the next class. Thank you once again.